Okay, so this video is going to cover CPI and market baskets, which comes from Chapter 8, The Cost of Living. So CPI just shows how much the cost of a market basket has changed relative to the cost in a base time period or location. And that's calculated by doing the price of the basket in the current year over the price of the basket in the base year times 100. And this is calculated by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, or the BLS, and they just try to come up with a basket that represents the typical household. And then a market basket is just a list of specific goods and services in fixed quantities. And then the goal of creating this is to see how the cost of buying the goods and services on the list change over time. So we'll look at market basket structure first, and like I said, it represents a typical household. And essentially the BLS is trying to come up with a basket that represents a typical consumer. Even though everyone buys different things, it's impossible to have a completely accurate representation of what people buy, and so they're using just the typical consumer, and it's more of an average. So just by looking at the bar chart towards the right, it shows how much prices in certain sectors are weighted in the calculation of the CPI, which is important to keep in mind. And then for the market basket, to calculate it, you use something called the basket approach, which gives us a single number to measure how much your total costs rise over time. And you use the percent change formula, essentially, which is listed at the top. It's the current year minus previous year over previous year times 100. So for example, if you wanted to see how much the overall cost of your groceries has increased, you would multiply the price of each item from last year by its quantity and add those numbers together to get the cost for last year. And then you would multiply the price of each item from this year by its quantity to get the cost for this year. And then using those two numbers, you would use the percent change formula, which again is listed at the top, to calculate the price increase from last year to this year. And then just another thing to note, the percent change formula is super important to know and just be familiar with, because it continues to keep coming up throughout other units. And then moving on to CPI and just the main facts about it in the US. So a few things to note: the CPI accounts for 93% of the US population, and it does not include people living in rural areas, members of the military, or the institutionalized. And then if you look at the graph to the right, so over time the slope of the line shows the rate of price increase. So for example, the steeper portion between 1973 and then 1980 reflects high inflation during that time. And then prices were much higher than they were, or just by looking at the graph, you can see that prices are much higher than they were in the early part of the 20th century. So it's just that steady increase over time. And then for CPI, it's the price of the basket in the current year over price of the basket in the base year times 100. So again, it's very much just the percent change formula. And it shows how much the cost of a market basket has changed relative to the cost in a base time period or location, which I know I mentioned the definition a few slides ago, but it's just important to know the definition of both the CPI and market baskets and to be familiar with them. And then by definition, the index will always be 100 in the base year, which is another good thing to keep in mind. And then just a few other things to note is when looking at CPI, the BLS only includes goods that are consumed by the typical US consumer or domestically produced and imported goods. So these are all good things to remember and keep in mind, and it's helpful to look back on the textbook and look back through the workbook to become familiar with these things.